Hello and welcome back to the show. This is Penny Sansevieri with my fabulous co-host, Amy Cornell. And first off, we want to thank you all for listening. We're getting so much tremendous feedback on the show. Amy, while you and I were still sort of in the quote-unquote virtual green room preparing for the show, I mentioned to you that I talked to a lot of authors who say, oh, I found you because I listened to your podcast.
I love that so much.
Yeah. And, which is amazing because you and I both have this addiction to true crime podcasts. So it's not like we haven't reached that popularity, but I think that people really like listening to the show and hopefully, send us feedback. Our contact details are always in the show notes that you can reach out to us. We love your ideas. We also love reviews. So, and I encourage listeners, if you've been listening to the show for a long time, you know this, but I always encourage listeners, share one tip or one thing from the show that is your takeaway that you're going to implement and put that in your review. And we've had a couple of folks do that on iTunes in particular. And it's really kind of fun to read what folks, what writers' takeaways are. And, but wherever you listen to podcasts, we just got approved for Pandora and we are now on Audible. And so we are just, guys, I always like to say, go big or go home. We haven't seen any of your books under the new free promo that we are running on Can This Book Be Saved, which started March 1st. So as soon as we start getting submissions, if you have a book that you feel like is not doing well enough, the instructions are in the show notes as well. So reach out to us and we will evaluate it during one of our upcoming podcasts.
Yes. Don't be shy. We'll be nice. I promise.
I know. And I realize that sometimes our feedback in these shows can maybe seem a little bit harsh, but we're all about honesty. And I think that if you really want to succeed, you really don't want somebody just patting you on the head saying everything's going to be okay, because sometimes your book needs to be fixed. And unless you fix it, everything's not going to be okay. So that's part of why we created this podcast and also why we want to do these promos. And speaking of promos, we always have discounts and goodies and things like that. If you're listening to these shows out of order, which I know a lot of you do, just be aware that some of the promos that we have from February of 2020 or March of 2020 are going to look very different to what we have now. So be sure to check these. Every month we change up our promos. So every podcast in the podcast show notes in the month, those will get updated. Whew, that was a mouthful. Amy came up with a really great idea for the show. This is all Amy's. You're going to hear her more than you're going to hear me. She is somewhat of our children's book expert. I do not have offspring unless you count my dog, who sometimes feels like my child. But we see we're big fans of children's books. And I, again, even though I don't have kids, I love really well done children's books. And we love working with children's book authors in particular because it's such a great way to enrich a child's life with a really, really great, helpful, engaging, well done book. And so, Amy, I'm going to let you kind of take it and where this idea came from, because I know you and I have discussed this offline quite a bit.
Yes, definitely. And it's very true. Books are, and I think even more so in the last year with people spending a lot of time at home, a lot of family togetherness. Like I think there are a lot of families that have conceded to allowing more screen time and just getting a little more relaxed about how their children spend every second of their day. But that's another reason why I think books really had a chance to shine as well, because it's a great reason to engage kids off of a screen. That's still something that is very much relevant to parents, to have something that legitimately gets a kid's attention that is not an iPad or a phone or a video game or a television show. Not that they don't have their place, but a really great book can be game changer, honestly. And I'm a mom of girls who are 5 and 8. And what really prompted this was kind of how to promote children's books and figure out who your market really is. Because in their short lives, there is, one day where they can enjoy the same thing, and there hanging out and everything aligns right. And then the next day, basically, they have nothing in common. They don't want anything to do with each other. And they seem like there's a decade in between them instead of just a couple years. So it really stands out to me when, that authors need to keep this in mind when they're deciding like who they should promote their books to and who they wrote it for and what kind of families they should be reaching out to and things like that. Because the idea that children's books are kind of all encompassing across age ranges is a very slippery slope to start going down.
Right. And so really what we want to address here is that, well, we realize that authors want to create the biggest, most inclusive potential buyer market they can, meaning, children's books that span lots and lots of age groups. In some cases, it can really backfire, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's very difficult to split your marketing efforts between, say, parents of very young kids who can't read on their own yet. So you're talking like pre-K, and then parents of kids who are already going to slumber parties and things like that and having sleepovers, because the messaging has to be very specific to those parents and their lifestyle situation and what's going on with their kiddos. Because if it doesn't resonate with them on a personal level, they're not going to want to engage with you, and they're certainly not going to spend their money on your book. So if you try to lump them all into a single group, they're inevitably going to feel less seen, to use a term that's very popular right now,
Yeah.
And they're going to be less connected to your brand and to your product if they don't feel like you've really hit the nail on the head with something that is relevant to them.
Right, exactly. And you bring up a good point about splitting the market. Can you define what we're actually calling children's books?
Yeah, that's really great because, you're touching on a good point, because children's books, as I said, like they do have quite a range just in general when we speak of children's books. So I would say, again, like early pre-K, and that could go all the way up through middle grade, because middle grade, it's not really seen as, if you agree, Penny, as a super robust standalone category like YA is, like young adult.
Mm-hmm.
Middle grade kind of speaks to a certain age group, but it's not its own category for the most part. And I don't want to get off track here, but, there are a lot of adults that read young adult labeled fiction, because sometimes those are just fantastic stories.
Mm-hmm.
And there are some really great storytellers that technically work in the YA space. So it's appropriate for younger people, but there's no reason adults of those genres can't also get into those storylines. But you don't typically see adult followings for middle grade topic books. So for the sake of this episode, when we're talking about children's books and things like that, I just wanted to be clear that we're mostly focusing on like pre-K through age 12 max.
Right. And I think that it's also one other thing that is worth mentioning here is there is, even though I realize that this is not necessarily the age range that we're focused on, there is very little crossover between middle grade and YA, which is part of the reason why for age appropriate books, you got to really focus in on the needs of that particular age group. And I don't want to get us off track, but I think that it's worth mentioning, because I talked to an author, I guess a few weeks ago, and she said, well, this could be a little bit of, new adult and some young adult and some middle grade. And I'm like,
oh God, no. To be candid, I just took a sip of my water and I almost spit it out.
Right. I mean, but that's probably the issue. And I think that's what we talked about is like, you can't be all things to all people when it comes to, in particular, the children's, middle grade, young adult, new adult market. And I don't want to get us too far off track, but definitely spend the time figuring out what your age group is and what the needs of that age group are. Can you give us an example, though, of the biggest issue that you see based on the authors that have reached out to us?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the most common issue we see stems from an author who has written a book because it teaches a lesson of some sort or speaks to something going on in the world today, which is absolutely admirable, because those are great motivations for writing books. But I think the trap that a lot of them fall into when figuring out their market is saying like, oh, this matters to all children. And this is a great lesson that everybody needs to learn. So my book is for 3 to 10-year-olds, And it's like, Yeah. I mean, I agree that your book has potentially taught a lesson that it matters to all human beings. This is something we all need to figure out at some point. But the reality is a 3-year-old and a 10-year-old are very different children and what interests them. And it's not just about the age range. So it's not just like, oh, but my 3-year-old's really advanced, but it's more than that. It's into how the book was produced as well. So we've seen authors come to us with this wide age range, but when, Penny and I are looking at the book, we see that it's predominantly pictures, with just a little bit of text. And sometimes those pictures definitely skew young based on how the characters are represented, especially if there's people in it. And not say it's not just a bunch of animals running around talking.
Right.
But a book like that is not something that's really going to catch a 10-year-old's attention. They are not going to be drawn to that. It's just going to seem too juvenile for them. And not that, if it's happened to sitting around their house and they've got a younger sibling, they may look at it, but that's not enough for you to base your marketing plan around that, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, and on the flip side, we get authors that come to us with a wide age range again, like, oh, it's for 3 to 10-year-olds. It's super relevant. Everybody needs to learn this. It matters. But the book is definitely, when we're looking at it, written for independent readers. It's text heavy. The vocabulary could even fit into a chapter book. So even if it's not designed as a chapter book, the word usage and things like that is definitely for an older child. And to expect a parent to read a text-heavy book to a 3-year-old or believe that a 3-year-old will learn something from it or sit through it long enough to actually, absorb much of that is just unrealistic. 3-year-olds are like goldfish, very short attention spans.
Right.
So I think that's something else that we see that that contradicts itself a lot. So not only going too broad with your potential market and just saying like it's relevant to everybody, because let's be honest, Penny, we get people writing adult books. They're like, everybody wants to buy this book. It's like, that's not a marketing plan.
Right.
Same goes for children. Saying that all children are going to love your book and parents are going to want to buy it is not a great way to base your marketing plan. And the production of your book and how you structured your book really plays into that as well. They have to complement each other.
Right. Exactly. So I think that if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I was getting ready to put my book out and maybe I have to go back to the drawing board. Or if your book is already out and it's not doing as well in sales, there's no reason that you can't go back to the drawing board. It may just mean, positioning the book description differently. Maybe the book doesn't need any kind of a makeover for it to fit. You've just been offering it to the wrong market or too big of a market. But I think I don't have children. If I were to write a children's book, the first thing that I would do is do a lot of market research. And I would start it by buying books that were similar to the age group that I think that I'm going to be writing for. And I may be pleasantly surprised and it would be, and it matches perfectly. But I think that the second tier of this is really, to my mind, and Amy, maybe you disagree, reach out to teachers, right? Reach out to people who are, or, if a mom's group or something like that, and get lots of feedback. I've known some folks to get onto Nextdoor, for example, which is, if you're not familiar with Nextdoor, it's a great app that kind of connects neighborhoods. And you could put a call for, moms, you want to share the book with them and say, give me your feedback on it. I mean, I think you really have to go, if you are not a quote unquote expert, you really have to go straight after your market that way.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. The market research is super important because, again, I would think that if you're writing a children's book and you currently have kids, even that, you're still too close to your own work to be completely objective. So I think the market research piece is really important no matter what. So, definitely if you don't have young kids in the house anymore, it's important. But I think even if you have little kids running around, and that's why, Penny, I love your suggestion of reaching out past your immediate circle, because you really want, you hit the nail on the head, objective feedback, because you don't, you're not going to learn anything by just reaching out to people that you're really close to. And as you mentioned at the top of the show, like getting that pat on the head, like, oh, it's awesome. I love it. You're going to do great.
Yeah.
Like that's really not helpful. It's nice. There's no reason you can't get some of that too, but just make sure you balance that out with some people that can also tell you something that you may not want to hear if needed.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that is really, and I always ask for that. And Amy, that, even though I don't write in the children's market, I think with any book that you're doing, and in particular children's books, you got to get that critical feedback, because that's also going to save you a lot of money in marketing that isn't really moving the needle or isn't really getting you book sales, because you're going after the wrong readers. To that end, illustrations, super important. We see a lot of really gorgeous children's books. And I will tell you that one of the first things that I will say when I get off the phone with an author who's written a children's book is, like, sometimes I will text Amy, or if I, send the book over to her so she can take a look at it, and I'll just ooh and ah over the illustrations. And again, I don't know what is necessarily age appropriate. I can kind of guess. But the illustrations, if they don't blow me away, I'm probably not sold on the book. And I think that, parents are very much the same way. I think a super strong story doesn't necessarily trump, especially when you're going after really young children, a super strong story doesn't necessarily trump poor illustrations, because the illustrations and the cover are exactly, is what people see first. The other piece of this illustrations, let me say, is that be careful who you hire. I mean, obviously, you want to hire the right person, but you also want to make sure. So let's say you're doing a series, or let's say it doesn't even have to be a series. Let's say that you're going to do several different children's books, right? When you're talking to that illustrator, make sure that they can be in this for the long haul. I mean, things happen. And I had editors years ago, as an example, that are out of the business or too busy or whatever. But to the degree that you can, make sure that your illustrator is in this for the long haul, because some may have copyright over their illustrations, like if they create a character, and if that person goes away and you want to have, this is a character in your children's books that you want to carry from book to book to book. So just make sure that, or if they license the character over to you so that somebody can copy that as well. The licensing, it's interesting. The licensing of illustrations is one of the last things that authors think about, right? And you could potentially hire somebody on Fiverr. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it. Not that Fiverr's bad. We get, good people there, but I think the illustrations, somebody really has to be, that has to be kind of their job to do children's book illustrations. But if you hire somebody at one of these sites, make sure that you have some kind of an agreement with them. If you decide that you want to create lunch boxes. I don't even know. Do kids still have lunch boxes? Like this is what I like, but if they want to have, if you want to create a toy or a stuffy or, bed sheets or whatever, because I've worked with authors before who have had product, and the product can actually, in some cases, be even more profitable than the book. So make sure
that's the dream, right?
You what?
I mean, isn't that the dream, that you create something that can grow in so many different ways? I mean, I think that's what all children's books authors should be.
Yeah, absolutely. So think bigger, right? Because if you've written, a romance novel, you can probably switch cover designers and still be okay, right? But illustrations, that's just that's an entirely different animal. And I know, Amy, you also feel passionate about illustrations. You want to share some of your thoughts?
Yeah, the artwork really does matter so much. And to your point about, the story, actually, when you're talking about children's books, especially, is almost secondary to the artwork. Yeah. Because you really sell somebody on just your artwork or your cover alone for a children's book. Because again, it's like, especially for the younger age groups, it's like, okay, yeah, like the story matters, but like what's really going to be engaging is the visual. Let's be honest. Mm-hmm. So it really does matter. And I will not spend money on a book if the art or illustration seems cheap. I'll just be honest.
Yeah.
And sometimes, and we've worked with authors that have come to us before or that have reached out to us and like, oh, but I drew it myself, or my granddaughter drew it and I had an artist like replicate it, or they have a friend that, you know what I mean? Like they've got this backstory as to why they went in the direction they did. But honestly, it's like, I don't care as a consumer. Like, I don't care how cute or touching or personal the backstory might be, because if the artwork doesn't wow me in the first couple of seconds, I'm just going to move on.
Right.
And as a consumer, you can't bank on them giving you a pass on subpar art, or, you know, why your stick figures are actually super meaningful and endearing, because they won't get that far. That's the reality.
Right. Exactly.
It's nice to hope that somebody would get to the point where they're like, oh, okay, these drawings were done by, you know, and then but you can't bank on that. Right. So you really have to be very careful when it comes to anything that is not done by, as you said, Penny, somebody that really, this is their business. This is what they do. You know, they do book illustrations, and not all art is the same. You know, we run into that a lot, Penny, where we have authors of all genres come to us where they've had somebody do their covers because that person knows art programs for an entirely different industry. You know, they're like, oh no, they're really good with all these things like InDesign and all this stuff. It's like, well, but book cover design, you really have to have a sense of the publishing industry as well. You know, there's a lot more that goes into it. So just because you have the programs and or you know a friend that like, oh yeah, they work in a marketing firm and they do like logos and stuff all the time. Like a person that's excellent at logos isn't always the person that's excellent at book cover design. Right. You can't just assume because somebody's strong in one area that you're going to trust the entire future of your book, you know, in the art around that, because, you know, they do one thing really well. You have to really, like you said, think big picture, think long term.
Exactly. And I think that this also goes to book covers. I mean, if you imagine, you know, a busy library and it's reading time for kids, or there's our local library has a whole, you know, section of the library set up for kids with little tables and books everywhere. And the books that the kids are grabbing have beautifully designed, colorful, vibrant covers, because the most visually appealing is what the kids are going to gravitate to. I mean, that's not a stupid assessment, is it, Amy? Because I know you'll tell me.
No, not at all. Kids are very critical and they pull no punches. And parents already spend a boatload of money on all sorts of things trying to entertain their kid, even for 5 minutes. So, So they will not take that risk by spending money on your book if you don't blow their socks off from the get-go. Because the reality is, like, we've got enough stuff going on where kids surprise us all the time. So really, your book needs to be a sure thing. Because again, books are already competing with, if we're being honest, like they're competing with iPads and phones and TV and video games and all this other stuff. So there's really, you can't have a subpar children's book and expect to compete for those dollars that parents are spending on trying to keep their kids engaged and entertained and educated.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, you know, to that end, websites, because we've worked with a number of children's book authors who just have these amazing looking websites. And then there are some children's book authors that say, well, you know, the work to put together a children's book with the illustrations and the cover was so much, I'll do the website later. And I completely appreciate the fact that there's a lot of work that goes into those children's books. But when some years ago, we worked with, and this book always sticks out in my head because it was just so cute. And it was a story, it was a friendship between an elephant and a mouse, right? And the theme of the book was that, you know, children can be friends with other children who are different than them, right? So what the author had on their website was a page that, you know, you had to put in your email address. So obviously it's the parents, and you could get the pages in PDF, the coloring pages. And then because the person doing the book actually did, like, he was an illustrator before he did, like he was an illustrator first and a children's book author second. And it actually worked out really, really well for him. But he added ringtones and he added, which I think was probably a little bit, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it was a little bit too old for that group. But basically, his next books expanded on his audience and he had all kinds of fun downloads. So screensavers and images and fun things. And he really created this engaging website, but a lot of the content, you had to give, the parent had to give their email address because this guy knew who his audience was. He realized it wasn't 5-year-olds buying his book, right? He knew that he was going after the parents. So he created this website that really engaged the parents. And I think, if you're doing, if you're on Instagram, I was going to say if you're on any social media site, but I think Instagram is probably a really good place for this. Asking parents to send pictures of their kids reading the book and doing prize packs and things like that can also really, not only does it share the importance of reading and children reading and getting engaged in books at an early age, but it's also kind of a fun way to involve your audience. And I just can't, I think that, the website for children's books, even more so than almost any other industry, you can really have a lot of fun with that. And you can do little, sidebar character stories and some back, even creating worlds and things like that. If your book is set in a different, in the jungle or where, in a different city or something like that. So you can really have a lot of fun with that. Anyway, but I think that, websites, I don't want to get too far down the road, but websites really spend the time to get creative because it'll also keep drawing readers and parents in to become part of your tribe, so to speak.
Yes, absolutely. It is really a huge deal because again, kids, keep coming back to it. Creating that kind of crossover between, not just the physical book, but also the online elements is really just the reality of where we're at today. Right, Penny?
Right.
I mean, you really can't just say like, no, I'm going to stay traditional and just keep it to the book. And I don't need a website or I don't need, you know what I mean? It's like, that's not really the reality of what it takes to compete anymore.
Yeah.
But so I love that idea that you had of like the screensaver and stuff, because my kids we've got a family iPad. And they definitely like to choose the pictures for the background and things like that. And that would be brilliant if one of the authors of the books that we have right now had an image with their characters or something cool from the book that we could download for the background image. So anybody listening, work on that. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
And then please send us a link to your book and let me know that you've done it. And I will absolutely follow up with you. But another important thing to touch on, again, is like bridging that gap between online and, having a physical book in your hands for children is the social media element. And as you said, Penny, it's about engaging the whole family. So yes, you need to know the age range, but knowing the age range also means better understanding the parents that are potentially buying the book and supporting your brand and making recommendations to their friends and things like that. That's another important piece. Parents absolutely rely on other parents to recommend things to them. And we take it as law. So if you can get parents recommending your books to their friends, that is a huge deal. Absolutely huge deal. But so when it comes to social, keep it fun, keep it useful. Some of the things that I love seeing children's book authors do, they do some things that are kind of silly. Jokes are huge, especially for kids in the 6 to 8-year-old range. They start to understand humor and comedy. And so if that's your age range, some silly jokes would be awesome. My almost 8-year-old really loves to tell jokes. And it's okay, I want to teach her some actual good ones because so I would absolutely love it if an author posted fun age appropriate jokes that my kids could learn. And as Penny mentioned, images of the kids with the book, that's a great thing to share on social if parents are willing to share those with you, because again, that just shows that that's another way to visually show that other parents are recommending and using your book. Parenting hacks, again, back to being useful. Social should be useful also. So cool and fun parenting hacks that are age appropriate is also a really great way to show the parents that you are somebody that they want to keep going back to. Quotes are always great. And, ideas for, especially with, I'm in the middle of spring break right now while Penny and I are recording this, and we've got summer break coming up. So if there's any cool craft or even STEM project ideas that can complement either your book's topic or the setting or theme, that would be amazing. And these don't have to be fully fleshed out, like you've written out step by step what to do, but just give parents some ideas, to spark some ideas for things that they could do with their kiddos that also, again, bring it back to what your book is about. Make those multiple connections. And oh my gosh, I could go on and on, because honestly, if there were two of me, I would love my second me to work exclusively with like branding ideas and brainstorming with children's books authors, because there are so many creative options available to you as a children's book author, and so many ways to just be fun and whimsical and do things different and quirky and have it be appreciated. I can't. Like it's hard for me to rein it back in.
No, I think that's great. And I think that it is it's such a great market. And the reason that we felt passionate about this particular podcast was because we really just want to make sure that if you're out there and you think maybe your book isn't doing as well as it should, or you're getting ready to launch one, that you make sure that you do it right. Because that's, at the end, that's really what it's all about. And that's why we're here. Amy, I want to thank you for putting together the show. This was really, really, really fun.
I appreciate it. I was so excited about it. And, to be totally candid, everybody, Penny comes up with 99% of the show ideas and outlines them for us and things like that. So I'm like raising my hand. It's like, I can participate. I appreciate it. This was a really, really great, this was a great show. And we hope that you all learned a lot. We love doing these shows. We love your feedback. So again, feel free to email us. Our email contact information is in the show notes. And, you can definitely leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. We would love to hear from you and how you like the show. And we want to thank you again so much for tuning in. This is Penny Sansaberry with Amy Cornell, and this is the Book Marketing Tips and Author Success Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.